So welcome everyone. I am Beth Ribet, the director of Repair, and I'm really grateful to be able to be hosting this event today. I want to begin with a brief land acknowledgement. Repair acknowledges the Gabrielina Tongva peoples as the traditional land caretakers of Tongva, the Los Angeles Basin and South Channel Islands as they are now known. And we're grateful to have the opportunity to work for the Taraha Tom, the indigenous peoples in this place. We pay our respects to Hanuk Fatam, the ancestors, Ahihiram, the elders, and Iohinkem, our relatives and relations, past, present, and emerging. I'd also like to acknowledge our multiple co-sponsors for this event. We're really grateful to have the support of the UCLA American Indian Studies Center, the UCLA Native Nations Law and Policy Center, the UCLA Critical Race Studies Program at the School of Law, Ben the Ark Jewish Action, ICAR, Temple Beth just making sure I'm not forgetting anybody, I believe that's all. But it's been really wonderful to have such great partners in making sure that the word gets around about this event and that our speakers are supported. It's also my great privilege to welcome our three conversationalists today, Hector Amaya, Ginna Green, and Shannon Speed. I'm going to give very brief introductions. These are all people who've had and continue to have really amazing bodies of work and careers. And I don't want to eat up the time that we might spend getting to hear them and lauding all of their accomplishments. So I encourage audience members to learn more about them if you're not already very familiar. So very briefly, I want to introduce Shannon Speed as a tribal citizen of the Chickasaw Nation of Oklahoma. She is the director of the American Indian Studies Center and a professor of gender studies and anthropology at UCLA. She has published 7 books and edited volumes, including her most recent award-winning book, Incarcerated Stories, Indigenous Women Migrants, and Violence in the Settler Capitalist State. She also has a recently released co-edited volume entitled Heightened States of Injustice, Activist Research on Indigenous Women and Violence. Dr. Speed currently serves as the past president of the Native American and Indigenous Studies Association, NAISA. Next one to introduce Hector Amaya as a professor of communication in the USC Annenberg School. He's authored 3 books and has published dozens of articles on the issues of globalization, Latin American media, comparative media studies, immigration, and Latinx media studies. And I want to particularly acknowledge the ways in which his work on white nationalism and publicness and publicity has influenced my own and many others' thinking about the ways in which white nationalists occupy public space. I last but not least want to gratefully introduce Ginna Green, who is a strategist, writer, movement builder, and consultant and partner and chief strategy officer at Uprise. She is a Schusterman Senior Fellow and a Jewish Orthodox Feminist Alliance notable woman, also a fellow at the Kogod Research Center of the Shalom Hartman Institute in North America, and sits on the boards of the Women's March, Political Research Associates, the Jews of Color Initiative, Ben the Ark, and the Jewish Social Justice Roundtable. So again, very grateful to welcome this amazing group of thinkers and organizers into conversation. As far as I know, the 3 of you have never been in collective conversation before, so I'm really, really delighted that this is happening. And I want to just open with a question to any of you, so whoever would like to jump in first. And just sort of start to situate our discussion. So we all know that much of the public discourse engaging white nationalism has framed white nationalism as inexplicable, crazy, or bizarre, or in conflict with, quote, American values, unquote. So how, in contrast, might we explain white nationalism as it's rooted in the colonial origins and governance in the United States? Or to even simplify that question a bit further, how are you thinking about white nationalism right now? How do you understand it? How do you explain it to others?
Dr. Speed, do you want to go first?
Me?
Yeah.
Sure, sure. Yeah, happy to. Thank you. Thanks, Beth. Chukma, Hashlaka Chukma, Sahul Chifort Ihuitana, Chickasaw, Michichata Saya, Gabrielino Tongva, Oglakot, Yagnimako, Pisahanchi, Bika Natoka, Hachimanoili. Greetings, everyone. I just introduced myself as Chickasaw and Choctaw and acknowledged that I'm speaking today from the unceded lands of the Gabrielino Tongva people. I want to say thanks to Beth Ribet and Rbet for organizing this event. Thanks to all the co-sponsors and especially thanks to my co-panelists. It is very exciting to be in dialogue with all of you. And I'll just say in opening, kind of in relation to this question, Beth, so white nationalism isn't really, in a sense, my topic, but I've been doing some thinking and writing recently, mostly through the stories of Indigenous women migrants, about the persistence of white supremacy through a settler, like a lens of settler colonial analytic from an Indigenous studies perspective. And so what I think that lens does, so one of the important insights about settler colonial theory is that colony, as Patrick Wolfe famously wrote, is a structure, not an event. And because it's a structure, its logics are enduring. And so I understand white supremacy along with patriarchy as, foundational structuring logics of the settler colonial state. So I wrote an article recently that kind of partially shares the name of this panel. Actually, it was called On the Persistence of White Supremacy, that focused on the period following Donald Trump's election in 2016 and what seemed to be sort of widespread surprise at the fact that we had elected a racist and misogynist president and that so many people continued to support him despite the fact that he was openly so. And what I wanted to explore there was how even when important changes in policy or in public discourse happen, like the ostensible post-racial society under the administration of Barack Obama, and you could put scare quotes around that post-racial, it doesn't mean that white supremacy has gone away. It's just less visible, right? And we can't legislate it away because it's a fundamental organizing logic of settler colonial society, right? One in which social relations are ordered hierarchically based on skin color, as well as, like socioeconomic elements ideologically tied to notions of color, right? With white at the top of the hierarchy. So I know that's not a super cheerful perspective, but it matters, I think, because in the US, we're conditioned, ideologically conditioned, to fall into this kind of fallacious thinking that while there's some backward and forward motion, mostly we're on a progressive trajectory towards more equitable and just social relations, right? We often talk about backlash against progress as if this kind of unilinear unfolding of history. And, I think that obscures the structural nature of power and kind of overinvests in democracy as a force for social justice. So the last thing I'll say about that in relation to your question is that, so I'm talking about white supremacy and the panelist course is about white nationalism. And while those two are often conflated, they're different things, right? So I think of white supremacy as a structuring logic, while white nationalism is like the open embrace of that logic and the mobilization of social actors with the intent of ensuring its realization in practice, right? Or ensuring its continued realization. And the danger here is that white nationalist movements and actions often lead us to view white supremacy or as like extreme or extraordinary thinking and behavior, which obscures white supremacy's kind of banal workings in organizing everyday life. So in other words, whether we're thinking about it or not, whether it enters our consciousness through some violent group or action, white supremacy is always ordering our lives, right? So the absence of white nationalism does not mean the absence of white supremacy as a social ordering. So I'm talking too much. I'll leave it there.
No, but you nail. I mean, I would only say a couple things to add on to that. Is, I do make that distinction all the time in my work between white supremacy and white nationalism. And the way I think about it is, similarly to the way Shannon explained it, which is white supremacy is an ideology. It is a thinking, it is a structure, it is a way or a number of ways, actually. And white nationalism is a movement designed to achieve those aims of white supremacy that would mean most of the people, actually everybody in this little Zoom box, is not welcome in the world of white nationalists. White nationalism seeks an all-white ethno-state in the United States where people with white skin are at the top and it's only for them. This country is not for Black people. It is not for Indigenous people. It is not for Latino people. It is not for Jews. That is what they want. But at the core of that action, of that end goal that they want, is white supremacy, is this system that we have built this country on and with. And I think that I really just, what Dr. Speed was saying about, we can't, depending on how we look at it, we can see the banality of, of what we've built. And also, it's not just, white supremacy is not just the foundation, and it's not just what we built, it's actually the tools that we continue to use to maintain that structure as well. So when we're talking about how we fix it, what we do with it, it's so much more than changing a law, to the point where Dr. Speed was saying democracy, democracy in the hands of Jim Crow with wingtips is not the democracy that brings about my liberation. Right? So we actually have to, fix democracy and how democracy works in order for it to work for all of us. And so I think there's so much to think about in terms of what white nationalism means, particularly at this moment, and what it has meant for the last 50 years, and what white supremacy means, which is several hundreds of years older than white nationalism as a movement.
I think I have a little to add to what Ginna and Shannon have already said so well. But the long duration of whiteness as an organizing principle that allows certain communities to have power is astonishing. The very invention of whiteness and this society in order to organize populations that were dramatically different from Southern Europe to Northern Europe, people who traditionally had great animosity against each other, became organized under a banner of whiteness in order to actually to hold to a version of power that they felt very comfortable reproducing again and again and again in our constitution, in our set of laws, and our institutions. So that we are the product of white nationalism and white supremacy, it is undoubted. As Shannon put it, and so the sense of crisis that sometimes goes alongside today's discussions on white nationalism, and for people who had long looked at history, for people like me and for Shannon and for Ginna, this sense of crisis is out of place. It is white nationalism is the state of affairs, has been so for hundreds of years.
Thank you all. That's an amazing start to the conversation. I want to just dive a little deeper into the different meanings often associated with white nationalism. We have incarnations, as you've referenced, that are about an exclusively white ethno-state and conceptualizing deportation as an essential aspect of achieving the formation of that state, and others seem to be more focused on bolstering white dominance and ownership in political, social, and economic spheres. And sometimes we see white nationalists who identify with the concept but don't really seem to have a clear political philosophy beyond racial animus or aggression. Can folks comment a little bit more about how we should understand white nationalism? And is it a helpful term? When should we see it as coterminous or distinct from white supremacy? I know some of the comments have already engaged that, just hoping to, again, as noted, dive a little deeper.
I think one thing that I would love to start with is recognizing that white nationalism is not one thing. And so we do harm to our understanding of white nationalism when we start thinking that white nationalism is one thing, or even a single umbrella. It is actually many things, and it's many umbrellas, and people come from very different reasons to associations and communities that we, from the outside, label as white nationalists. but and the inside may not necessarily actually be described in any way that resembles that. So I say this because I think it is better to think clearly and to see clearly than to have something that cuts a great degree of clarity and can perhaps perform the job of a comfortable enemy. So I prefer to actually to think clearly and see clearly, even if this fragments my arguments, even if it makes my life more harder, even if I cannot just dump everybody in one single box. I rather multiply those boxes and think about who are the people who actually end up joining these groups and these communities that we label white nationalism.
Thank you, Hector. Ginna or Shannon, did you want to weigh in on this question?
Part of me wants to say it almost doesn't matter what the differences are. There's an element of, I mean, right, because whether or not someone considers themselves a white supremacist or a white nationalist, or whether or not they're okay with me being in this country as long as I'm subservient to them, or whether or not they want me gone or they want to send me back to Africa, right? Like, it's like, you still don't see me as human. You still don't see me as valid and worthy of dignity. And so whether or not you want me gone, dead, deported, incarcerated, or whether you want me present, but just subjugated and subservient, like it almost doesn't matter. But it actually, when we think about where white nationalism is showing up, and I make that joke about Jim Crow wearing wingtips, right? Like, white nationalists are now in government. They are in law enforcement. They're in high levels of government. And obviously, folks, racists have always been in many institutions, but we now have folks who are dedicated to white nationalist theory who have won state house races in states across the country. We have Congress people and senators who espouse white nationalist beliefs. And I think that this is like really important for us to recognize that, and I'm going to get like super political for a second, that like Trump, we raised the Trump era up already in this conversation, that he was just an outgrowth of the system. He wasn't like the system, he wasn't the problem. And I don't know about others, but I've been having this tremendous weight in the last several weeks that has felt very reminiscent of 2018, because we actually haven't solved any of the problems that we had before this country elected Trump. We still have exactly the same system that Dr. Speed referenced. We still have exactly many of the same laws on the books, many of the same people in power. And so we still have like so much work to do, even though we got rid of one big symptom of the problem with Trump in the White House.
Yeah, and that's a concern of mine, that it's like people think because we got rid of Trump in the White House, we've solved the problem, right? And it's, it's not going away. And Trump was, frankly, isn't smart enough to have an ideology. He's just an opportunist. And the fact that he gravitated to white nationalism tells us something about the state of people in this country, right? Because he gravitated to it because it was a popular ideology to be putting out there, right? And it got him reelected. I think we need to think about those things. And I think going back to your question, Beth, the original question about all these kind of multiple levels of the ways that white nationalism operates, right? I think, what you're saying about immigration, for example, and I've kind of thought about that as like the settler state, the way that the settler state enacts its sovereignty through white supremacy by, the monitoring of territory, the closing of borders to, the sovereign right to even decide who can cross those borders, et cetera, right? So there's one level of kind of state enactment of white nationalism through policies and practices and law. And then there's, multiple sort of enactments of it on the ground with all these different types of social actors, right? And I agree.
Charlottesville Rally, the Proud Boys,
right,
the
and
Patriot Front, right? Like all of the different ways we see, yeah.
Remember, there's a book about women, and maybe we want to talk about gender down the road here, but there was a book about, it's called Sisters in Hate.
Sisters in Hate,
Yeah.
Saber's book, yeah.
Where they sort of follow these three women to try to see how they got to being white nationalists, right? And they have very different trajectories and sort of different outcomes. But something that, I think that's important work, but something that bothered me about that is that it kind of like personalizes it as if these were all just kind of personal pathologies or personal decisions or choices, rather than, again, I think I have this over focus on the structural components, but I think it's important because otherwise we fall right back into that kind of individually pathologizing. How do people get radicalized? How do they become so extreme outside the norm, which isn't white supremacist, right? And so I think that leads us down, the wrong path ultimately.
So white nationalism in the United States has gained a particular type of media attention in the Trump era, culminating with the Capitol riots. And we also know that white nationalist and white supremacist politics can't be confined to borders. They traverse them readily and are never entirely geographically discrete. So where and how do we locate white nationalism? How do we make sense of it as a transnational dynamic or phenomenon?
I've done a little bit of research on that, Beth, and if you don't mind me just sharing, I've written on the massacre at Christchurch in New Zealand, and where the perpetrator, Tarrant is his last name, is an Australian person who used a vision of history that he learned while traveling and living in Europe, and who has given reasons that had to do with the white makeup, the threat of whiteness in Europe and in the United States in order to perpetrate a massacre against a mosque in New Zealand. And I say this partly is because to highlight the fact that actually white nationalism today is an odd type of nationalism because it is transnational, is global. It uses means of organization, cooperation, and that are web-based, and these have no borders. And so it is a very puzzling and difficult ideology for that reason. So when you have actually people like Tarrant actually behave in that way for the reasons that he gives openly to everybody who was willing to read the manifesto he wrote, I think it's like 57 pages manifesto, you start to understand the complexity. And when you visit actually places like 4chan and 8chan, which I've done also as part of my research, you can see people from everywhere giving each other's ways in which to think of themselves and succeeding at monitoring also the proper ways in which to think about whiteness. When I think about white nationalism, I think about diversity within white nationalist groups, but in places like 4chan and 8chan, this diversity is often eradicated because people are normalized into one way of thinking about white nationalism. And so it is fascinating to witness, by the way.
Absolutely. Shannon or Ginna, thoughts on this question?
I think this, where do we locate it? And Hector's reference point to 4chan and 8chan and all of these places where people are able to gather within this identity of this being within and around this whiteness. their whiteness, that their whiteness is superiority. And like, that is, I think the internet has really become, the democratization of knowledge also means the democratization and access to things that are antithetical to knowledge and growth and progress. And I think that when we think about where we're locating white nationalism, we're locating them within people. People are everywhere, and now people everywhere can connect, and they can now connect within and around this identity of being white nationalist and or white supremacist. And I think about what information and disinformation, and what is the space between folks who are in 4chan and 8chan and on Facebook, and like how that happens, and how information, knowledge, ideology spreads from these closed networks of people who are galvanizing around this identity and beyond. And that's something that I think about and was thinking about a lot during the Trump years, and thinking about a lot in, after Pittsburgh and after Poway and after Christchurch, and how people are accessing information and mis and disinformation too, which I think is all related. I think this is all together.
Yeah, and I think that it's we're rightly focusing on the internet and social media and the roles that they've played in recent years in kind of transnational white nationalism. But I think even before we had those things, it was transnational, right? When you think about something like the eugenics movement, right, which was, that got around, crossed a lot of borders, right? So I think white supremacy and white national and relatedly white nationalism have always been transnational in nature in some sense. And the very, where I kind of identify the birth of white supremacy globally is with European colonization, right? And so, it's part of the colonial project. It's always been there. So that's,
we had to have it, right?
Right.
Like, white Europeans had to have an ideology that would make it okay to go places where they haven't been, take shit that wasn't theirs, including people and land and resources. There had to be a way to explain that and to justify it. And we're living with that today.
Yeah. Exactly.
Thank you all. And I want to acknowledge a point Shannon made earlier about the challenge of sort of individualizing and pathologizing white nationalism, and still pose a question that runs that risk, and invite everybody to engage it carefully, which is, how do we make sense of the people emotionally and individually? Again, without, sort of playing into that trap of sort of almost fetishizing the personal narratives of white nationalists. How do we understand them emotionally and intellectually?
So that's what that book I was talking about was about, kind of this desire to understand, comprehend, how could it be that people are embracing this? I think, that is complicated, that comprehension is complicated by what we were saying earlier about the fact that there are so many different, actors and so many different enactments of white nationalism. So there isn't, one way that people come to be white nationalists. There isn't one kind of personal path that ensures it or something like that. There's all kinds of different ways. And the reason is because white supremacy as an ideology underlies everyone's thinking in this country, whether they know it or not. And so, you can take a lot of different pathways and to end up at the end point of embracing white nationalism, when white supremacy is part of the, the national structure of your country, the ideology of your country.
I think a lot about that, as well as white supremacy's relationship to capitalism.
Right, of course.
And right, like, all of this, we are able to be divided by race, which we've all said is a social structure. We made it up to do the things that we do around the world, particularly in this country. And absent the kinds of tension and friction that capitalism creates, right? Like, the way that we actually solve this problem is make it so that we've got a world where we're not all fighting for scraps. Because when everybody but the people who have money and power are fighting for scraps, then we permit race to be continued to be used as a dividing factor, ethnicity, like religion. We permit it within a capitalist structure. And so in many ways, I think about dismantling not just racism and white supremacy, but we actually have to dismantle capitalism and think about different ways to keep ourselves housed and fed and our needs taken care of, so that we don't have to fight for scraps, and that this is what happens when we do.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. Sorry, I know I already talked, but just to agree with Ginna, and I think, capitalism is by definition an unequal system. It's a system that generates inequality, and those inequalities have to be justified. And race, and white supremacy have been the dominant mode of justifying those inequalities. So it's not, and in my work, I always use the term settler capitalism, because it's both about settler dispossession, but also about capitalist exploitation that keeps these structures in place.
A lot of the, I agree with Shannon and Ginna on this. A lot of the grounds for resentment that you see, you find in white nationalist communities and groups and individuals is rooted, and if not rooted, at least justified in relationship to economics, and an economics of dispossession that actually it is the alibi that they use for themselves and their actions. And there is one that actually benefits the huge amount of the obscene way in which capitalism has morphed into the 21st century. And so instead of blaming the billionaires, we blame each other. And
Right.
And unsurprisingly, I mean, when you like the history of white nationalism is partly the history of using these economic arguments, by the way. So it's not only about today. Like every immigration purge that happened during the 20th century against Latinos, it started with economic arguments by the white nationalists. So this has been the modus operandi, but it is the way in which capitalism continues moving forward. And today, capitalism is worse than ever. So I agree that that is the bigger target in a sense, and white nationalists in a sense bear the brunt of the worst of capitalism, both because they actually do not fit the mold of because of whiteness and the racial contract. White nationalists do not fit the mold of docility that other communities have learned all throughout our lives. Being Black and being Latino and being Native American in the US has meant having low expectations on life. Being white has meant higher expectations on life, and these expectations are not being met. The resentment comes out as fury, as violence, and as hatred. And so, and for good or for bad, the docility that some of our communities actually show allows us to function without as much violence as we are seeing right now in white nationalist groups. But it is capitalism, the more complicated problem that we had in front of us.
Yeah, Hector, that point that Shannon, were you about to say something?
No, go ahead, Jean.
I was going to say that this resentment. So Dr. Sweet was talking about this individualism, this individuality that we don't want to let the state off the hook, right? By focusing on individual bad actors. And part of our American ethos is around individualism. And I think about, I don't know if folks read this book many, many years ago. Tom Frank wrote What's the Matter with Kansas? And he was like, why do so many white Republicans vote consistently, white working class Republicans vote consistently against their interests?
Yeah.
And it's because Hector, they think
Mhm.
that they could still become Jeff Bezos one day.
That's right.
As individuals
That's right.
and as white people, they could be that, right? That individual aspiration is so much a part of like our own psychology and pathology as a country. And it also keeps us from thinking bigger and better about dismantling capitalism and what could we replace it with, because whatever we can replace it with is not going to have this individual at the center and individualism at the center at all, because like that couldn't be what would replace that. And so I think that sits in my mind a lot.
Yeah, and I think, you know, that ideology, that individualism, American individualism, and the whole kind of bootstraps thing also plays into this rage question that Hector's talking about, right? Because white folks have been told that the reason other people are poor is because they're lazy and they're not working hard enough, right? And if you work hard, you can pull yourself up by your bootstraps and you'll be successful. And you know, there's this whole generation or two of white working class people who have worked very hard their whole lives and haven't gotten anywhere. They're seeing their quality of life going down, as Hector flagged. And I think, you know, that was crucial in this whole Trump moment. And, you know, going back to what Hector was saying about the different waves of, you know, immigrant expulsions, you know, Chinese Immigration Act, et cetera. In that article on white supremacy that I wrote, I very much link, so both mass expulsions in terms of immigration, but also resurgences of white nationalism to shifting phases of capitalism, right? So it's like when the contradictions of a certain phase come and capitalism needs to shift. And I would argue that neoliberalism has reached that point, that the inequalities that it's generated can't be reconciled within this country or internationally. And so something's going to have to shift. And I actually think that that opens a great moment for us in terms of thinking beyond settler capitalism, right? And so, because I'm always arguing that this is all structural and that it's not going to be changed with legislation or policy changes, people often think that I'm putting forward a very demobilizing argument, right? Okay, well, nothing can be done. We're just, you know, beholden to this. But, you know, I point out that settler capitalism has only been around for 500 years, which is like a blip on the radar screen of humanity. Like, we don't have to be organized this way. We can do something different, and we need to be thinking, you know, I mean, we need to do the work around legislation, around policy to kind of, but all we're doing is mitigating the damage, right? We need to be putting our energies into thinking about what Ginna raised, which is what's beyond this and how do we get there? And I think this is a crisis moment when we could actually have an opening for that, particularly with global warming and the kind of crisis, environmental crisis and other crises in the world, right? So I think people are thinking about change in ways that maybe they haven't for the last few hundred years.
And that this really feels existential. Like I mean, I'm not a historian, but to your point, Shannon, like humans have been around for a minute. We haven't always done things the way that we're doing them right now. And to get super tactical, and like the US midterm elections are basically tomorrow. I mean, like, they're not really, but if you're running for office and you're the DNC or the RNC right now, you're thinking, oh my gosh, we got to win some elections. And I'll be also again political and thinking about, okay, what happens in midterm elections and what do we know? Parties in power don't win. That's like historically what happens in this country. So what are we preparing for? What are we doing in our state and local communities to get ready to like do something different and embrace, like, we had all people, bodies, hands, whatever y'all got, people brought it this past election to make a difference and to put a stop against what we saw happening with the Trump ascendancy. And I feel like there is a real question right now of, yes, we need to be able to dream. We've got to be able to dream, think bigger, think beyond this. And there are some real nitty gritty brass tacks things that we got to do money in politics, ethics, voting rights. You know, there are things, there are laws and there are policies that we actually have to fiddle with and tweak and fix now, so that we actually can have the space to dream about something different and put that in place, because that takes some time.
An ongoing tension, how to respond to the moment without becoming eclipsed by it.
Right.
So thank you all for helping us to think about that. I want to shift our focus just slightly because all the topics are deeply interrelated, but Shannon raised the subject of gender a little bit earlier. And I wanted to invite folks to reflect a little on masculinity and hypermasculinity as one of the staples we've seen in white nationalist identity formation in the United States and in a number of parts of the world. And also to acknowledge that we witnessed more women publicly identifying with white nationalist politics in the recent era, though I wouldn't say that the involvement of white women in white nationalism is confined to the present moment at all. So can we think a little bit more about the gender politics of white nationalist movements in the United States? What can you share with us to help make sense of their complexity and continuing imprecision and varied manifestations?
And I feel like this is one of those talk about people acting against their own interests, right? Because white nationalism is bound up with patriarchy, right? I view those as completely intertwined logics of the settler capitalist state. And so, you know, putting yourself into a context where this kind of hypermasculinity, patriarchal hypermasculinity is, you know, the environment just seems, I mean, this is why this woman wrote a book about it, because it's just like, how could you be acting so against your interests here? But, you know, anyway, that's not a very, a very subtle gender analysis, but I agree with you, Beth, that, you know, women have long been involved in white nationalism and white supremacy. And again, going back to the eugenics movement, like women were the ones who were actually like enacting eugenics movement, right? Or the Daughters of the Confederacy or whatever, you know, getting all the Confederate statues erected all over the country as monuments to white nationalism. So it has a long trajectory.
And I think about, yes, white supremacy and white nationalism are bound up with patriarchy, but also white women were able to exercise some power and agency within a patriarchal white supremacist structure, right? So like, I mean, back in the day, white women, and when I say back in the day, I'm talking like,
do you mind if I have some milk?
No, go ahead. That was my son. I warned the panelists that we might see some of my children, but since I've got my back to the wall, y'all didn't get to see their faces, so you just heard them.
Hi.
Oh, well, that's number 3 out of 4. But I'm thinking about the fact that during the first few hundreds of years of this country, before we became a country, but women didn't have any power, they didn't have any vote, but they could buy and sell people. That was something that white women could do from the very beginning. They could own property, who were my ancestors. And so that was a source of wealth and mobility and access and power. And then we move into post-Civil War, post-slavery, and white women then become actors in lynching. And we see, you know, the power that white women are able to wield in that era of time. And we also think about like women, white, Black, Indigenous, Latino, but all are always doing the work. Like every movement has women doing the work, even if we're not visible. And I think that that's another mistake to make, that just because we're not, that like we know Richard Spencer's name and we know Proud Boys and we have like a very gendered idea of what white nationalism looks like. But you know, to the point that the book that Shannon referenced about Sisters in Hate, there are women behind the scenes lifting up and supporting white nationalism systems and structures. And even as it is patriarchal, they have found a way to have some agency and power within it, which that's what we all want. And so they're also protecting their own power and access in the system too. So there's a lot to think about. And then we all know, sort of from on a pedestrian level, like we know about the Karens, right? And white women who are, who do the interpersonal acts of racism, and they also support the systems themselves. They provide labor to the movement and labor to the work. And I think it's really important that we don't let women off the hook for the same reason that we don't want to let individuals off the hook. That if we don't look at the full complement of what's at play here, then we can't really fight it.
Yeah, the one thing that I can add is the huge importance of incel ideology in contemporary white nationalist movements as well, which is one of the most egregious forms of patriarchal, anti-women, homophobic ideologies that you can imagine. So yeah, but it is the racial patriarchy has always been racial patriarchy, isn't it? So we are just seeing actually, and it's performed by men and women. It's not performed only by men. This is let's not confuse, the fact that women are part with the fact that they are not working on behalf of patriarchy. So yeah.
Sit back to some of the initial points. Thank you all for that discussion. One more question to the full group, and I have a few for some of you individually, and I can see a number of our audience members also have different important issues that they're raising in the chat.
The chat is on fire.
Yeah, I'm just trying to scroll through it, and also like I cannot watch the chat when I'm actually participating, so I'm like sometimes
I know I'm like getting distracted by the chat.
Some of y'all need to come up here on the panel.
I know.
We will definitely circle back to some of the great questions and comments that folks are raising. I do want to take a moment to talk about religion. White nationalist violence has been serially targeting places of worship, several of which you've referenced already, including mosques, Black churches, synagogues, gurdwaras. And while not all white nationalists embrace a religious identity, we know that Nazism is often intentionally divorced from religion. Some, such as the KKK, explicitly claim Christianity as an additional basis for nationalism, and color their nationalist claims with an imagined divine sanction that legitimates white supremacy, which of course is not new in United States history and in the European colonial process. So now, in contemporary moments, how do we make sense of the relationships between white nationalism, white Christianity, and the particular aggressions that we keep seeing directed at communities of faith?
One of the things, so this is not about the contemporary moment, but in thinking about the relationship of European colonization and white nationalism, at least one of the roots of the ideology of white supremacy comes out of the Iberian Peninsula, and the discourse of racial purity that was generated as part of the Reconquista from the Moors by Christians against the Moors. And so I think that's because I work in Latin America, I think about that one a lot, because Spain colonized much of Latin America, but I think it's a really important point for all of Europe. Like it's one site that I can identify where the discourse of white supremacy emerged, and it was directly in relation to a religious conflict, right? So, I think that's, and it was, and in relation to Christianity in particular, or seated within Christianity in particular. So I think there are historical roots there that are important to take account of.
And
I don't think, oh, go ahead, Hector.
no, go ahead. I mean, when you think about the attacks that we have seen in the last few years, you know, against Black churches and against mosques, against synagogues, you know that they are attacking the things that we love the most, the spaces that we consider sacred. This is not simply an anti-religion move, it's also is meant to injure us the most. And these are sacred spaces. These are sacred spaces. I find white nationalism very complex when it comes to religion as having one religion. You know, contemporary formations are often citing Nordic religions as their basis for organizing their own spiritual imagery, which is something that the Nazis did in the past as well. But just to share with you that I find the question very complicated, you know, by these current formations that we see. And while Shannon is right that actually the Reconquista put all the emphasis on religion as the reason we were killable, reason we could and they could steal from us, today is complex, you know. Yeah.
I don't think that, I mean, there are folks in my world who don't really use the term white nationalism that much anymore. And they actually are using Christian nationalism, because the white nationalism that we see in the United States, while, and, you know, movement wise and ideologically, foundationally, it's global. What we see in this country is a very Christianized version of it. And I think that even for folks who would not necessarily call themselves Christian, we are seeing a type of pro-Christian environment and embrace that is to the detriment of other religions and faiths that aren't, even if there isn't an active support, belief, or commitment to Christianity as a faith. There is actually an open rejection of other faiths as worthy too.
Thank you all for these excellent points. I want to come back to some of what Shannon's been sharing about history, and pose this question to you, Shannon. Can you comment on the importance of memories and stories and histories of colonization, white supremacy in Turtle Island, but not limited to this place? How and where are memory and history important in helping us to respond to the ongoing racial and colonial crises that white nationalism particularly tends to manifest or articulate?
Yeah, I mean, I want to just sort of answer in simple terms that that memory and history are crucial, right? I mean, and that's why the histories come up over and over again in the course of our conversation, that, you know, we aren't viewing what's happening right now as something new, some new phenomenon, but it's rather, you know, part of a very persistent structure that's tied to settler capitalism. And, you know, people's memories, like, they're like the evidence of those histories, right? They're like the kind of embodied experience of that history, right? And so I think capture, obviously, someone who does oral history, I believe very strongly in the power of Indigenous women's stories, of oppressed people's stories, and the ways that they, you know, carry lived experience of colonization, of capitalist exploitation. And so I think the more that we can present them, it also kind of humanizes the discussion, right? And it's not just a phenomenon of white nationalism, but something that is, you know, lived by people in their bodies, in their daily lives.
Thank you for that. I also would love to pose a question to Hector. In your prior analyses of white nationalism and publicity, you've delineated some common and troubling elements of white nationalist communication, and particularly the uses of populism. Can you share a little bit more about this analysis with the audience? Meaning, what are some of the strategies used to make white nationalism seem palatable or rational, or to mask the nature of racial violence?
I think, thank you, Beth. I think we talked a little bit about the importance of common sense economics, the way that actually economics had been often the basis for this type of populism. But also we have actually the sense of normalcy associated with claiming that this is a white nation, and all the way in which we have a memory of our history is a memory that is elected through the prism and through the filter of white supremacy. The fantasies that actually this nation begat in Plymouth or in Jamestown, these are ridiculous. And then the last one is perhaps something that we see against immigrant communities of all nature. But the idea that in general that global South immigrants don't have the economic or political values to sustain our political institutions, a deep distrust on our ability to preserve that which many Americans claim is the most lovable and worthwhile aspect of our nation, which are its liberal and democratic values. And so you put all these together, and suddenly you have actually the rise of populist voices, it's so easy to be a populist white nationalist and have a spot in radio or television or now the internet. It's so easy, and so it's so much harder if you don't have that voice to have any type of media presence. So the people that right now we have normalized the presence of the Rush Limbaughs of the world, of the Bill O'Reillys of the world. These actually are trajectories that were remarkably simple to accomplish. Stardoms that were remarkably simple to start on because they got the fuel of white nationalism behind them.
Thank you, Hector. That's really astute, of course. So one question I'd really like to pose to Ginna. One of the aspects of contemporary white nationalism that seems to keep startling and bewildering a fair portion of the population is the persistence and visibility of anti-Semitism. In public discourse, there often appears to be uncertainty regarding how to understand the presence of anti-Semitism within US racial politics, or how to situate it as part of a landscape of white supremacy, to the extent that that's getting acknowledged at all. Can you comment on these dynamics and on the role of leadership and analyses from Jews of color in developing an effective response? We might have lost your audio. Doesn't look like you're muted. I'll give Ginna a sec. If not, we can move to the next question and come back to her as soon as her Zoom is restored.
Can you hear me now? But now
Yes, we can.
Okay. Weird. All right. So anti-Semitism. That was the universe's way of saying this is one hell of a question Beth just posed at the end of our time here together today. But let me just do a little bit of some situating. First off, anti-Semitism is a real thing. It also doesn't look or behave or act like racism or homophobia or Islamophobia or any of the other types of oppressions and isms that exist in the United States. It looks different. Anti-Semitism is, in this country, in the United States, looks like scapegoating. It looks like blaming Jews for problems. It looks like George Soros conspiracy theories. That is not the same thing as, and that's what it looks like now. But there were times when anti-Semitism looked like not being able to get a loan, just like Black folks couldn't get a loan for a certain neighborhood. It looked like not being able to go to college or only being able to be one of 10 in a college class. It looked like back in the day in Europe, it looked like being given the job of tax collector and the person dealing with the money and being the lenders. Like it meant being given the jobs that nobody wanted to do. So, and anti-Semitism has changed, it's morphed, it has become in every era what it has needed to be for the powers that be who have built that into the system. So we're looking now at anti-Semitism in the United States during a time when arguably American Jews have disproportionate access to resources, wealth, education, great neighborhoods. This is all 100% true. And the rise in active hate crimes and violence against Jews is rising as well. And so I think it's important to recognize anti-Semitism looks different, and it does still put Jews in actual danger. And quite frankly, Jews aren't in danger alone. Everyone else in this little Zoom box is in danger too, in a white supremacist, white nationalist system. All of us, for white nationalists, are targets. And so I think it's really important to understand that. So let's just hold like what anti-Semitism is, what it has looked like, what it looks like now, how it happens here. Then I think within white nationalism and within white nationalist response and how we're understanding it, it's important to know that as a movement, remember in the beginning, I said white supremacy was an ideology, and I feel like white nationalism is a movement. In that movement that really we saw gain steam before the ink was dry on the Civil Rights Act, of like, how do we put these Black folks in their place? And one of the ways that anti-Semitism has animated this white nationalist movement that we've seen over the last several decades is by asking the question, how did Black folks how'd they win? How'd they get the vote? How'd they get the Voting Rights Act? How'd they get the Civil Rights Act? What was at play? And the theory for white nationalists who believe in this movement is that it was the Jews. The Jews were behind the scenes. We saw this come up again with the caravan, with the blaming of George Soros in recent years. The Jews were the reasons. We were the ones, and for folks who don't know, I'm Black and Jewish, we were the ones pulling the strings of the Black puppets. There's no agency for Black people because Black people are not good enough, smart enough, strategic enough to get those wins on their own. So Jews meddling, getting behind the scenes, in it for themselves. And so there is a foundational connection that a role that anti-Semitism plays in the white nationalist mindset. To them, Jews and anti-Semitism is like one of the core pieces of this modern state that they want to dismantle as well, is not having Jews be responsible or agents of change or pulling some of the strings that we want to pull. So I really think it's important for, I think, all of us to understand how anti-Semitism behaves, how it acts, how it's different from other oppressions, and how it's still actually live and active in 2021.
Thank you, Ginna. I appreciate it very much. I want to just elevate a couple of things that are coming in the chat. We likely won't get to all of them, but we've had a number of folks pose questions about what do we do? What are the things that we see as effective means to facilitate change? And I'd like to hear a little from each of you about what you find most urgent or most promising or most productive in thinking about what our responses to white nationalism can be.
I feel like there's, again, because I was kind of saying earlier that there's a couple levels to what we need to do, right? I mean, we need to continue to fight through, through policy and through practice and practical matters to try to, keep them under control and minimize their damage and their violence. But at the same time, I think it's really crucial that we be thinking much more broadly. I think I feel like we've overinvested in kind of American democracy and its potential to actually achieve social justice when in a society that is structured against social justice and structured for inequality through settler capitalism. I think we need to be thinking beyond settler capitalism and thinking about other ways to organize ourselves, other ways to live in the world. And what I've been really inspired by in recent years, honestly, is the abolition movement, because I think there, is a movement where people are really thinking beyond and saying, look, this is not reforming the police department. This is about radical change and creating the world that we want, right? The society that we want, a society of care, a society in which people don't have to be criminalized and incarcerated, or people don't have to commit crimes because they're actually cared for, right? It's about visioning a different way of living in the world. And so I hope that we can all kind of, take a page from the abolitionist movement handbook and really start thinking in this way about, what we would want our society to look like beyond settler capitalism, and then start implementing it day by day in our lives as we live them.
That's powerful. Hector or Ginna, want to weigh in on this question? What is it that either inspires or is motivating you right now in terms of making change?
I 110% agree with what Shannon said, and envisioning communities of care and really having care be foundational, not capitalism. And I think care moves us from a space of a scarcity mindset to one of abundance, where we all can have exactly what we need and more. I mean, when my Shlomo, the kid who just walked in and asked for some milk, he said to me the other day, he was like, I mean, really, we should all just have our main bills paid for so that we can do the things that make us happy. Like, how old is he? He's 9, and he said that. And I feel like that's what we want. That we want to be able to take care of everyone, so that everyone's needs taken care of, so that people can do what their desires, really what brings them joy. And that feels really important to me. But so I will underscore that and then say, however, I believe that as a progressive, as an activist within a progressive movement, I believe that we have left the states and the courts to the right for too long. And while I agree that there are limits to democracy, minority rule is one of those, is a concept within democracy that makes it really hard for us to vision and move forward if that's what we really want to do, until we get to, that's the thing. There are elements within democracy that are hard, and local level work at the state level, state houses, state legislatures, those places, we have, we don't have one constitution in this country, we have 51. And those states do things every day, every session, that affect the lives and well-being of people in them. So we need to actually do more work at the state and local level with our partners across difference, across race, class, gender, and we need to pay more attention to the courts and figuring out how we make, what is the role, given that we have a country where the courts are a co-equal branch, and that's what we got right now. We can't leave it on the table like the right has not done for many, many years. And there needs to be a strategy that recognizes that. So I got a little high end up there, up top with the vision, and then a little bit of take care of your states and your courts too.
A couple of years ago, I began writing an article about the killing that happened in El Paso, Texas, in the Walmart, where the perpetrator, his name is Patrick Curtius, targeted Mexicans and Mexican Americans. And I began writing this also in the same way in which I had written about Christchurch. But then I found his manifesto, which was much shorter and used a lot of Tarrant's language. Curtius' manifesto read like a suicide note. And it broke my heart. He was a young man who perpetrated this atrocity and who was acting in the way that we associate with suicide. And so after that moment of reckoning with my own understanding of what white nationalism, I began thinking that there are different ways in which to be effective and to be in the space of white nationalism. One of them is actually to learn to understand who they are as they are, and that we don't have enough knowledge. I understood also, because it wasn't my heart at the moment, I was hurting at the time, that it was easy to vilify and to make cartoons out of these people. And that is, dehumanizes them in the same way that we are dehumanized often by them. And I wanted to stop that. I wrote a very different article. And my commitment is to understanding. I think all of us have different ways in which we can address white nationalism. I don't think there is one single solution. I think we have 3 examples here. All of them will work. And in different spaces, they are proper ways of engaging it. I hope that when we are thinking about care, we're also thinking about care for them.
Thank you all. Those are really, really fruitful responses that make me want to pose about 10 more questions we don't have time for. And I just want to acknowledge, for me, one of the things that's coming up as I'm listening to the various answers, particularly listening to Shannon and Ginna, is this continuing tension between investing in and trying to change the state while also acknowledging its settler colonial origins, right? You know, can we invest in the idea of US democracy without somehow affirming US white supremacy, US colonization? So I think there's some questions that we obviously can't unpack fully today, but I just want to acknowledge. I also wanted to acknowledge that we have an audience that's, oh, go ahead, Ginna.
I was going to say on that question, Danielle Allen out of Harvard, I don't know if you've read her book. She's written a book sort of about that, in defense of political equality, which is like reading the Declaration of Independence and looking at the Declaration and the Constitution, like how do we get what we want out of something that started like that? She grapples with a lot of these topics, and I would recommend checking her out.
Thank you. And that leads me to one of the other things that's coming up. We have an audience that's very mixed today. We've got folks who found this event on Facebook. We've got academic colleagues, we've got organizers, and all of that I think is coming up in our chat responses. For folks who are newer to thinking about the issue, we have a few questions. One, we can see people have different comprehensions, and some are sort of, asking, well, what exactly is the relationship between racism and capitalism? Is there a foundational text you might recommend, whether to a student or to a non-academic, to start to think about it? Yeah. And we also had a question that was sent to me, but was for the panelists, asking, can anyone recommend a book on the history of women and property in the United States? And I'll mention briefly the text that just came out in 2019 by Stephanie E. Jones-Rogers at UC Berkeley, titled "They Were Her Property, White Women as Slave Owners in the American South," which touches on one of the issues that Fina was raising earlier. So references for folks to start to think about race and capitalism, and also to start to think about women and property, women in the United States, women and white nationalism in the United States, although we have had some references there too. Gina's recommending Decolonizing Wealth in the chat. Anything else folks would like to raise?
Black Marxism. Black Marxism by Cedric Robinson is fantastic.
Racial Capitalism is also by Cedric.
I was going to say almost anything by Cedric Robinson.
Yeah.
I was going to mention the Jones-Rogers book as well, too. Think of a few. Yeah, Julie. Yeah, I think I saw that one. Think of a few.
And again, that reference from Hector is Black Marxism, Making Radical Tradition.
I posted the link right there, and I recommend all of the book, but the first chapter would be enough to have a clear understanding of the relationships of Marxism to race and to capitalism.
Okay. And also just wanted to ask if, again, for foundational readers, for students, what are some of the texts you might recommend to just start to better understand the history of European colonization in North America and Turtle Island? Any particular recommendations for new learners, new readers? Gina has suggested in the chat, Stamped from the Beginning.
Audra Simpson's Mohawk Interruptus.
Thank you.
Anything by Patrick Wolf on settler capitalism, on settler colonialism.
Wonderful, thank you. One other issue that came up a couple times in the chat that I wanted to put to the panelists is at the time of this event, and some folks may be watching the recording later, but Palestine and the state of Israel are very much in public consciousness. And some of the folks in the chat are either making observations or just inviting the panelists to comment in light of today's discussion. I'd love to hear your thoughts about that.
Sorry, Beth. Can you say that again? I was still thinking about books and I was like completely missed your question.
Absolutely. So there have been both comments and a question in the chat asking the panelists to respond to the current moment, in particular as we're seeing some of the things that are happening in Palestine and looking at the relationship between Palestine and the state of Israel. In light of our topic today, I think that there's definitely interest in hearing some of your thoughts.
Ooh.
It's a huge topic, but I think I would just say, I think what's happening makes a really interesting example of settler capitalism and dispossession that is tied to it, right? So.
Yeah, I think it's important that we recognize that that some of the most important work on settler colonialism is based on Palestine, not only in the North Americas and Australia. And secondly, that Israel is a very diverse society, and I think we do a huge damage to our own understanding of the conflict by assuming that Israel is doing one thing. Israel is a complicated nation, is a very diverse nation, and Netanyahu has held on to power barely.
That is so true about Israel, and the way I approach the conflict and the region and thinking about this moment that we're in is that the land has been shared for millennia. This, like, we actually know, we know how to share it. We've done it before as people. Like, we have shared that land. And to Shannon's point about the nation state and Israel, and to what we've seen in that comments, like, there is the land, there is the state. It is complex, but the reality is that at the end of the day, there are people, multiple peoples, who have been on the land for millennia, who have shared it, who have lived not in conflict. So we actually do know how to do it. And I think that there is a disruption. Similarly, similarly, as we think about the United States and what we need to dismantle here to make progress and beauty and possibility true, what do we need to do there as well? Because, like Shannon mentioned, settler colonialism, settler capitalism, relatively new inventions. And I'm not saying that all human beings have all lived in peace and harmony, kumbaya, forever, but the land, Israel, Palestine, we do know their history. There are peoples who have shared it before. And the way we must look at it, from my perspective, is that we need to be able to share it again. And it's not about sides. It's about, like, us all being a side. And I come at this as a Jew of color, as someone who is moderate, who I consider myself pretty progressive, and also appreciate Hector naming that Israel is a complex state. And that is absolutely true.
Yeah.
And it's fucked up some shit.
Yeah.
And it needs to do better. We all need to do better.
But I think a lot of Israelis, people in Israel right now are feeling like some people in this call probably felt while Trump was in power. And recognizing that actually the government is not necessarily representing them.
Yeah.
So we're going to close in a moment, but I wanted to just see if any of our conversationalists have last thoughts that you'd like to leave us with, whether about our future, the areas where we continue to gain clarity, the things that you find troubling or hopeful, or the points that you would particularly want to just raise up and elevate one last time while we have a moment together.
I love the first
please.
time that Shannon began with care, by the way. I wanted to elevate that again and to put it back in the front of the table as an organizing principle, for all of us. Not only in the thinking about white nationalism, but also thinking about what's happening right now in the Middle East. And when I have people who I love on both sides of the conflict, and it breaks my heart. It just breaks my heart. And it is, so care has to be part of the center. Shannon, I stole your thunder. It's your word.
No,
and
I think
sorry,
that's beautiful, and I think that's a great way to end.
That's beautiful.
Agreed.
Yeah.
Shannon or Ginna, want to give us any last thoughts? No pressure.
Just want to say thank you. Thanks for organizing this, and thank you for the conversation.
Yeah, ditto. Thank you. It's really
Okay.
great to be here with y'all.
So many of our audience members have been asking if the event is being recorded, which it is, or whether they can access the recording, which you can. It should be available on our YouTube channel in about an hour. And if you register for this event, you'll receive a direct link to it. I want to invite folks to join us if you happen to be free tomorrow around the same time, 12 p.m. Pacific, 3 o'clock Eastern, for a poetry reading. One of the ways that we care for ourselves, rejuvenate our souls, is to gather and to celebrate language and emotion and spirituality. And we're very grateful to be joined by Black feminist disability poet Tari Pickens, who's going to be introduced by Kaisi Lehman. So we've got just an incredible combination of people coming in tomorrow, and I hope many of you will come. I will put the link to register to that event in the chat. It is free and closed caption. And Tari is really an amazing presence to hear live because she likes to sample bits of the music that was inspiring her and mix that in as she's in between her readings and interact with the audience. So these are just, tend to be even very joyful, even when they're painful events, getting to hear her read. I also wanted to invite folks to join us next week on Friday, the 28th at 12 p.m. Pacific, 3 p.m. Eastern Time for a conversation about decriminalizing survival, focusing on policing and punishment of people who are sexually exploited, primarily in the United States, though we definitely will give it some transnational and anti-empirical context as well. So I hope folks will join us then and come hear Kara Jabola Karolis, who is amazing, and Yasmin Vafa and Melanie Thompson. I feel incredibly blessed to be in conversation with these three really brilliant women and activists. So again, that's Friday at 12 o'clock Pacific time, and the prompt to register for that is in the chat, and that's Friday the 28th. Thanks so much to everybody who showed up for today's conversation. I want to just express deep gratitude to Shannon, to Hector, and to Ginna. I think maintaining clarity in a way that is intellectually engaged, emotionally intelligent, clear about our relationships to communities, compassionate but not confusing, compassion with complicity is not an easy set of lines to walk. And I really appreciated our panelists today for just bringing their best selves and their brilliant thoughts. and felt very grateful to be able to hold the space with you. And again, thank you so much to our audience, and we hope to see you again very soon.
Take care, everyone.
Ciao. Thank
Bye.
you all.